All right, hello. So I know that this is 5 o'clock and half of you guys are jet lagged, but I hope this is going to be entertaining for you. I got some good stories to share. I'm pretty excited to be here too. I went to last year's Monitorama, and it was a really great experience. Had a lot of good conversations, got to meet a lot of new interesting people, and had like some really crazy late nights at the bar. And it was well worth it. And so when Jason asked me to come and speak at this event, I replied not only yes, but hell yes, because I was just super excited to be a part. So thanks for having me. And I want to kind of kick things off here by just a quick question. I want everybody in the room who is responsible for a production system to raise their hand. That's pretty much everybody. Okay, keep your hand up. Hold on. I want you to keep your hand up if you have maintained a system that has never failed. So hire that guy back there and then this guy over here. There you go, done, recruiting. But seriously, like all systems fail, right? That is just a part of our life. We have to come to accept this. It is just baked into our industry. And so I've kind of just taken this really, kind of weird path, I guess, over the past couple of years, and just trying to understand what that actually means and how to live like a happy and healthy life, knowing that the things that I work on are going to break, and there's potential for me to let people down, and there's just a lot of kind of intricacies I think that we can explore here. And so one of the first ways that I kind of approached this problem was defining what failure meant for me, and I came to conclude that the worst thing that we can do when a system fails is not be prepared. And conversely, the best thing that we can do when a system fails is be prepared, right? The best thing that we can do is not prevent failure. It'll happen. So the achievement, we'll be successful if we can meet the failure with some sort of plan, with some sort of, if we get blindsided by it, that is what failure actually is. So today, I kind of want to just explore some high-level topics of what failure might look like, and I do that just so we can kind of understand, kind of what we're up against, and to potentially look at a few different techniques we can use to mitigate it. So I hope you guys like airplane stories. I also hope none of you guys are too nervous about flying on airplanes. This could scare you, I guess, but in all seriousness, I love airplanes. I get just giddy when I get on an airplane. Like when I got on, I took a 747-400 jet from San Francisco to London, and I was freaking out, man. I love to see those ginormous engines. I like to think about all of the thought and the detail that went into putting that airplane in the air. I mean that is just crazy that I can get into this tube, go up 33,000 feet and travel at 600 miles per hour, and it's like a relatively safe thing to do. Like statistically, swimming pools kill more people than airplanes. I mean, that is just like nuts, the amount of complexity and the amount of engineering that these guys put into these airplanes. It's really impressive. So one of the things I like to do is just I'm kind of a geek when it comes to airplanes, so I like to read NTSB reports, and I like to understand what happens when things go wrong, and just all the techniques that go into aeronautical engineering. And consequently, I found a lot of interesting parallels that I've been able to directly apply to some of my day-to-day work. So I think the part that really gets me excited is telling the story of a particular incident or a particular situation, and then kind of concluding it and drawing parallels from it and trying to figure out how to bring it back into some of my day-to-day stuff. So I got a few stories to share with you guys about airplanes. And the first story is Southern Airways Flight 242. So this particular flight took place in the 1970s, and it was a very short flight, very routine flight. It went from Alabama to Atlanta. And in case you're not familiar with United States geography, the two states are right next to each other. This was a 21-minute flight. They weren't even going to be able to fly long enough to get up to a normal altitude. They're going to fly up to about 14,000 feet, and then basically once they got up there, they're just going to go right back down again. So, very small routine flight, nothing out of the ordinary. Except for this particular day, it was summer and it was in the South, and that's a very hot time to be, for that part of the country. And so when it gets really hot, there tends to be more thunderstorms and more weather activity. So on this particular day, there was a pretty gnarly storm brewing, and in fact, it was noted that a few of the passengers on board had even commented wow, I can't believe we're actually going to fly on this. But sure enough, the pilot, there are two pilots operating the flight, and they started taxiing down the runway, and they made their takeoff, and it was successful. And they started climbing up to their altitude of 14,000. And when they got there, it got really worse, actually. The rain had really started to come down. The flight was really bumpy. Passengers were quite nervous, and it was a very dicey situation to be in. So this particular plane was a DC-9. It's two-engine jet plane. The engines, you'll notice, are mounted on the rear of the plane, not on the wing. And in this particular airplane, it was equipped with a weather radar that the pilots quickly were drawn to in this particular situation. Now, the weather radar that they were using was the Bindex RDR 1200. Now, how many people are familiar with the Bindex RDR 1200? Okay, so quick recap on the Bindex is that it's a weather radar that has basically two colors. It has a dark color and a light color. And the light color indicates kind of treacherous storms, bad weather systems, and the dark color represents the absence of those systems. And so the pilots, as soon as they got into this dicey situation, they looked at the radar and they're like, okay, I see a hole, over there, and this is all captured on the audio cockpit recording, of course. And so it was great to be able to hear what they were actually talking about. And literally one guy said, "There's a hole right there. Let's hit it. Let's go there and let's get out of this mess." And so the pilots they clear their vector with the Atlanta Tower and they make their move. And just as soon as they move over to this place, the pilot says, like, oh my God, look at the radar. Like, this hole is now collapsed. We are now in this storm. And in fact, the storm got like a lot worse. There was hail coming down. One of the passengers noted that the hail was just beating down on the engine. Like, there was huge dents in the engine. The hail was so bad that it cracked the windshield on the front of the plane. Like, imagine these pilots, like, thinking that they're going to a safe spot, and they get greeted with hail that's cracking their windshield. I didn't even know, like, a windshield on an airplane could break. I mean, I assumed it was just like some super, material that was, I don't know, it could stand anything. But the windshield broke. And as soon as this happened, the plane started to lose a little bit of power, and it went dark. And this is when people really started to freak out. So people on the plane are in this really bad weather situation. The electricity completely goes out in the cabin. In the cockpit, the pilots have no control. They have no instruments. They have no radio. But things come right back on. So that's like a 5-second downtime. So when the radio comes back on, the pilots, they talk to air control and they say, okay, look, air control says you need to get up to about 15,000 feet and we think we can kind of navigate you out of this. So as soon as they heard that, the pilots just jammed on the thrust. And right when they did this, their left engine failed. It lost spool and it just died. And so they report that to the tower. They said, we just lost one engine, mayday, like things are getting pretty bad here. And just as soon as they reported that, guess what? Engine number 2, down, out, like completely loss of power. And so when both engines crashed, they went back into dark mode again. So no electricity in the cabin, nothing in the cockpit, no radio, no hydraulics. And it takes, on the DC-9, there is a backup power generator, and it takes 2 minutes to spawn up. And so the pilots were at about 14,000 feet. They had just lost all power, and it was known that the DC-9 actually would descend at a rate of 56 feet per second. So if you do the math, that comes out to 4 minutes. They've got 4 minutes to get this plane to a safe place. And 2 of those minutes, they know for sure, are going to be dark. So they basically have 2 minutes after they get their power back to put the plane in a safe spot. So 2 minutes happens. I can't imagine what they were thinking in that 2 minutes. And the people in the back were like, just freaking out. One guy like wrapped himself in his leather jacket, and he was just basically trying to protect himself from landing, crash landing. But anyways, so the 2 minutes comes back online, and the radio tower says, hey, look, the closest airport is 20 miles away. They say, we can't make it. So the pilots start looking around out the window for a field to land in. So they're scanning the area. Nothing comes up. So then the pilot says, okay, look, we got to find a highway. I think I see one over there. Can you get a good view of it? Is it straight? The co-pilot says, nope, not straight. He's like, well, that's what we got. So the pilot brings the plane down, and he puts the plane on the highway. And this is the result of what happened. So I'm kind of conflicted when I show this stuff because plane tragedies are awful, and like I can't imagine the stress that people related to the situation had to endure. And I think that it's an awful thing when we lose lives. And I'm so kind of I don't know, glad that I don't have to write code that depends on people, dying, because I write so many bugs, it's not even funny. But I think the greater tragedy of these types of situations is if we don't learn from them. Like, it already happened. We can't change that. And so the way that I like to think about this stuff is, well, what can we extract from this? How can we learn from this? How can we use this to, fuel back ideas into our society and our projects? So, what went wrong? Well, what went wrong with this flight anyways? A bunch of stuff went wrong, but there's a couple things in particular that I'd like to point out. So the first one is that the radar misguided the pilots in the storm. And this is interesting because in the NTSB report, they did kind of a post-mortem analysis on the situation, and they noticed that the pilots made a pretty drastic change in maneuver based upon the radar information. And so somebody goes to look at the Bindex RDR 1200 and understand, what could have possibly led to that misinformation. And somebody digs out this gem, and it's buried away in this really obscure manual that was referenced in the NTSB report. And it said that, the Bindex works most of the time, except when the weather is really, 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 really bad, it misreports bad areas as good areas. And so the hole that they were flying into, it wasn't they thought this was the safe place. In fact, it was the worst place that they could possibly fly into. This was the worst part of the storm. The attenuation, the radar attenuation on the system was so bad that it just couldn't report anything. So it says, this is the worst part, so I don't have anything else to say on it. So that was just a huge problem, right? The second problem is that the pilots applied thrust right after they got off the radio. So basically what happened was there was water and hail that just fueled it, or that poured into the engine. The engine went into a surge. The last thing that you want to do when your engine is surging is add more thrust, because you're basically just creating this huge combustion chamber, and there's no way to outlet the pressure. So what happened was the pilots just blindly said, oh, we need to get to 15,000 feet, crank on the thrust, and that shattered all of the blades in the engine. So the engines were toast after that. There was no way that they could possibly ever bring that engine back to life. And the worst part of the situation is, and I don't really have any commentary here, but they actually found out later that the pilots kind of flew over a landing field that neither the tower nor the pilots knew about. And so the whole tragedy could have basically been avoided had there been some knowledge around the landing field. So, okay, so that was a great story and all, but how can we kind of rope this back into some of our day-to-day activities? And the question that I like to ask, or the thing that I learned from this particular story, is understanding how a system will fail. So I took the liberty of finding the brochure, or the README, maybe, of the Bindex RDR 1200. And you can read over all this. It has all the nice features like continuous full-time targets, no fading, no fading, and no freezing or whatever. But they don't really mention that the system breaks down when it's really severe weather, right? You don't find that in the README. You don't find that in the brochure. Likewise, you might evaluate a particular piece of database technology, and you're going to go to the front page, you're going to go to the documentation. You're not going to find out how this thing is going to screw you, or if you're using it correctly, or what things you need to be careful of. And so the takeaway here is that when we are looking at new technologies to put into production, we can't just look at the features and use that to determine what is going to put in there. We need to take a step back. We need to find people who are using it. We need to talk to them. We need to understand what their horror stories are. We need to find out how the system is going to fail. What experiences has somebody else had with that particular system? And we need to use that and bring that into our judgment when we go to make a decision. So, story number 2, British Airways Flight 9. This is a much more happier story. So, and this is also probably one of my favorite stories because it has to do with 747s, and I love 747s. So, British Airways Flight 9 took place in the 80s, and it was a flight scheduled out of London to Perth, Australia, and they made a layover stop somewhere in between. And at this layover stop, they got a fresh crew, and they were on the last leg of their journey, and everybody was really excited to get home. So they take off in the 747 heading to Perth, Australia, and they get up to about 36,000 feet, and they're cruising, everything's fine. The captain decides that he needs to, and I should mention that the captain here is the first captain in British Airways crew to fly a 747. So they have literally the most experienced guy when it comes to 747 in the cockpit of this plane. So he goes away to take a little break, steps out and uses the toilet or whatever. And when he does, all of a sudden the flight engineer and the first officer in the cockpit see this strange phenomenon. It's really crazy what they see. Blue flames are just like covering the front of the aircraft. and they're starting to freak out. But the engineer on board was like, no, don't worry about this, no problem. This is called St. Elmo's fire. This is a natural phenomenon when a rigid object passes through a moisture system, and there's like this electricity that gets created on a rigid surface, and it creates like this blue flame looking thing. So the engineer was like, nothing to worry about, this is typical, it's happened before. But the first officer was like, wait a minute though, like I'm looking at my weather radar and there's no storms, like there's nothing going on here, so that doesn't make sense. So obviously they were encountering a natural phenomenon. Another thing that I'm glad I don't have to deal with in my career as a software engineer is accounting for natural phenomenons, because they're basically infinite and you can't really do anything about it. So anyways, they bring the captain back in, and the captain is like obviously alerted by the situation. He's like, there's nothing on the weather radar, but we got St. Elmo's fire. Just as he sits down, he looks out and he sees that his engines are on fire as well. And not only the blue flame, like this mysterious ghostly looking blue flame, but they're actually like spewing out like red, yellow flames. And so, and it was just one engine, so he's like, okay, no big deal, we're going to kill that engine. Luckily, the 747 is actually designed to fly on just one engine. So there are 4 engines on the plane, but you can get by on one. So they kill the engine, and just as soon as you do, guess what happened? Yep, another engine failed. And so they're trying to report this on the radio, and next thing you know, all 4 engines have failed. Now, in the 747 manual, they talk about what happens when you experience a 4-engine failure. And they say that is not actually an engine failure, that's an instrumentation failure, because there is no way that all 4 engines are going to fail. But these pilots who are at 36,000 feet looking at these engines on fire, their plane is covered in this blue flame, think otherwise. They're like, holy shit, we are going down. And so, so they keep their cool though, and they're like, okay, we're gonna like kind of cruise this out, and we're gonna restart these engines. And so what you can do is you can like turn on some special battery, and then you can maneuver the plane upwards and then downwards, so you lose speed and then you gain speed, and this somehow like jitters the fan blades of the engine, I don't know, and it restarts it somehow. It's basically how I understand computers. Like you do some weird thing and you restart it, and maybe it comes back on. I don't know. So it's validation that what we're doing it happens in other industries as well. So restart away, by all means. NASA does it. So these guys are like, and you can imagine the people in the back of the plane. They're like on a roller coaster, basically, right? They're freaking out again. And to make matters worse, the back of the plane has all this smoke in it. Now, this is the 80s, okay? So you could still light up, in economy class, no big deal. But there was like this weird, thicker smoke in the back of the plane that people were noticing. And it was even caught on tape that one of the flight attendants said, oh no, I think I saw a guy with Turkish cigarettes, those are real heavy. And so, but then they realized, like, oh my God, the plane's on fire, like there's smoke in here, like something is not right. And so people really start to get concerned, and they even, like, and in all seriousness here, like they get out pieces of paper, they get their tickets out, and they start writing their loved ones. They literally are telling people that they're going to die. It's going to be, like, we were thinking about you right till the end. I love you, Mom. Love you, Dad. It was a very surreal moment for these people's lives. And as the pilots are still kind of like, they're descending, they're going down really quickly, and they're still trying to restart the plane. The pilot gets on the radio and says something really cool, I think, and I would love to meet this guy someday, but he was like, ladies and gentlemen, we have a little bit of a problem here. We have all 4 engines down, and man, it's the damnedest thing. We're going to get those back online, though, and we're going to get you home safely. That's what he said, and it was on recording. And it was just, it blows my mind how cool that guy was. But anyway, so they eventually make it down. They're falling out of the sky. So they're falling out of the sky, and they have to make a decision, because they either need to ditch into the Indian Ocean, or they found out that there's a landing strip in Jakarta, off the island of Java, but it's behind a mountain range, and so they have to understand whether they have enough power to clear the mountain range and put the plane onto the landing strip, or if they need to ditch into the ocean. Well, nobody has ever ditched into the ocean successfully. I think with the exception of Flight 1549, which ditched into the Hudson. But prior to that, nobody had ever ditched into the ocean, let alone without engines. So these guys, like, they were in between a sky and an ocean, or a rock in the hard place or something. And so they were making the last minute decision, and then all of a sudden the engines came back on, and people were like rejoicing in the back of the airplane, like, thank God, like, we're living. They started ripping up their notes and partying, and sure enough, as soon as they did that, all the engines, they failed again. all the engines, they start exploding, and so people went back into a panic mode. They're like, oh my God, like we thought we were living, now we're dead, and I don't even know anymore. Like, just ram it into the side of the mountain, let's be done with this. They didn't, though. They prevailed. So the pilots were not slow. They were sharp guys. They said, wait a minute. We went down, and the engines worked. Then we went back up, and they stopped working. Well, let's just stay down. So they maintained a low altitude, and then they eventually put it right on the runway. And when they landed the plane, the crew brought out champagne for everybody, and everybody celebrated life because they literally thought they were going to die. And so that was basically the end of the story. So what went wrong here? All the engines failed. That is a pretty big mistake, right? St. Elmo's fire, there was but there was nothing on the radar. The radio tower was not 100%. And as they were going down, cabin pressure changed and people had to put on their oxygen masks. And the first officer, when he went to put his on, it just kind of like it snapped off. And so he was incapacitated for like half the descent. Like he couldn't really talk or anything. So like just failures on all different fronts. And so, like, bringing this back into like how we can apply it to some of our day-to-day activities is just understanding what happens when the system fails, right? We've come to terms that it will fail and what we need to look out for in those failures, but what can we do afterwards? And you could do a lot of research and look at a lot of different industrial docs about like how to handle failure, but they all basically come to the same conclusion, and that is redundancy. That's your only real play here. But there are some caveats to redundancy, and I feel like I need to like highlight a little bit of them now. I don't think you can just talk about redundancy and not talk about its pitfalls. The primary pitfall, I think, is complexity. So if you look at this particular code snippet, we are issuing a database query against one database, and it's not redundant. If that database is down, we're screwed. We look at a similar example, and again, don't focus on the code, just look at how it changes. Right, so if we're going to query multiple databases and try different things and return the first result, it requires complexity. We had a simple thing, and now we have redundancy, and now the thing is complex. So we must look out for that. The second thing we have to look out for is independence, right? If we have a redundant system that is just a copy of the first system, so if in Southern Airways Flight 242, if they would have had two Bindex RDR 1200s, wouldn't have done anything for them, right? They would have had the same problem. And so one thing that is interesting to think about is how can you have redundant systems that have different implementations but the same overall function? A practical example of that is if you're monitoring the health of a web service and you're looking at requests per second. Most of the time you're going to have a load balancer and you're going to have web servers. So what you can do is you can create a chart that shows you the aggregate requests per second for all your web servers. You could also create a chart that has the number of requests per second from your load balancer. And these are redundant metric systems, right? Like you're getting the same information but from two different implementations. So if your load balancer starts to do weird things, you can always fall back on the number from your web servers. So there's a problem though, because how many redundancies do you need, right? You could go into this infinite regress of I need a redundant system for my redundant system, and eventually you have to come to this conclusion that we just need to pick out a component that just works. And so for a lot of tasks, this is a human being, right? These complicated space, aircraft, all these crazy machinery, they don't need some guy up there like cranking on a lever to make it work, right? Like the human isn't actually like doing anything. There's no bicycle that's powering the engines or anything. What these guys are here for is to like handle that weird case where the machines just aren't good enough to handle that failure. And they do other stuff too, but that's one of the rules. So another thing you have to look out is, and I think there's been some talk of this already today, but dormant failures. If you have an active-passive situation, like you're in for a world of hurt, you always want to have active-active redundancy. You don't want to wait and fail over to that secondary database server and realize that it's like full of logs or whatever, and it doesn't actually work. That's some pretty hard fail. And the last thing that I kind of want to touch on here, and I see this a lot, is just you don't want to mix concerns here. And so the analogy, I guess, if we're sticking to airplanes, is like you don't want the in-flight entertainment system being able to take down your airplane's navigation system, right? And so in the same way, you have to think carefully about what visibility tooling you bring into your application. It would be awful if you brought down your entire business operations because like some threaded metric implementation or some agent on your server that was just giving you visibility started to foul up. So those are kind of the high-level concerns that we have to consider when we work with redundancy. But that's all I've got. So thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to catching up with you guys later.